Start recording and let us share back. How does it do that? Go to share and all of a sudden it's gone. Why would it be gone? Let's try again. Here we go. Okay, everybody see it?
Perfect.
All right, so we were talking about matched groups and how to avoid selection effects. So we talk about how you could get each condition or each group within your experiment to be fairly equal to one another. So we can think about that in terms of demographic variables, in terms of skill or ability. If I'm interested, let's say, in college views, then maybe having an even split between years, right? So freshman, sophomore, junior, that there's an even split across all conditions. And again, the goal of managing selection effect is to reduce threats to internal validity. In other words, to try to control for as many variables as possible so that the results or the phenomenon that we experience between our independent variable and dependent variable actually has to do because of that relationship and not due to some sort of third variable that can be found within it. So that is the goal of selection effects. Next, let's talk about different designs that you can have within your study that can show stronger causality. Okay, so independent group. Sorry, there's like pieces of grapefruit that I just inhaled somehow all over my desk. So that's gonna get sticky. There's independent group designs, right? So different groups that you're comparing, and then within group design. So within the same group, I am analyzing performance between people. We'll also talk about post-test design only. That's when you only do a test once versus doing a pre-test and post-test design and the impact that that has. And then ultimately, which one is better? And we'll talk about some of them you cannot do pre-test, post-test. That's just not feasible. And we'll go into all those details. So independent group designs, that's between subject designs or between group designs. And those are different than within group design. So you have one group and you're looking at the difference between that specific group. So an independent group design is different groups of participants placed at different levels of the independent variable. So participants are randomly assigned, for instance, to the large group, large bulb group versus the medium bulb group, right? So there's two different groups and it's based on the condition of the design, okay? Within group design is each participant is presented with all levels of the independent variable. So if you did the color study test with the color ink, whoops, somebody trying to get in. If you conducted a color study and every participant was exposed to all three ink colors, okay, that would be a within group design, okay? So it's the same participant and they are presented all levels of the independent variable. Again, that's not possible in all studies. So let's see what that would look like. Well, actually, that's a little different. Now we're going to talk about post-test only. In a post-test design, you are randomly assigning your participant to be in one or of two groups. So you can have independent variable group 1, and then you measure that dependent variable. And same here, you're in group 2, and you measure the dependent variable on that node, okay? So the random assignment happens here. They then belong to one or the other group and you do your measurement on your dependent variable. That is a post-test only design. You only measure it once, okay? The example that we've used for this would be the ink color study, right? The experiment. So they get randomly assigned to either the red ink, green ink, or black ink group, and then you take their performance on the anagram test. That is a post-test only design, okay? Whereas you could do this, which is a pre-test, post-test design. So they're randomly assigned, you have them do an anagram test, you expose them to a certain color. These are the different conditions. So you've got the red ink, group and the green ink group, and then you have them do an anagram performance test again, okay? Here, what you're doing is you are controlling for the fact that the skill of solving for an anagram may be a third variable, right? By doing a pretest, you're getting a baseline performance, you're introducing the ink color, and then you do the test again to see if there's been any change in their performance, okay? This pretest post-test allows us a little bit more effectively to determine whether it is in fact the ink color that played a role in the outcome variable. Okay, everybody seen that? Okay, so one of those examples of pretest and post-test design, it's another fascinating study. So this is in 1998. They asked students, they were fifth graders, they asked fifth graders to complete puzzles, okay? The first test a puzzle, they're fairly simple for them. So they're grade appropriate puzzles. You can see here their performance on the pretest on these puzzles, okay? They were then given two options in terms of praise. They were given a process praise, which is you must have worked really hard at these problems, or a person praise, which is you must be really smart with these problems, okay? So process, talking about how hard they worked. Personal praise, you must be really smart, which is why you did really well, okay? Now here's the messed up part. Let's talk about how psychology ruins children forever. Then all children were asked to solve a second set of problems, except those problems were meant for 10th graders, okay? So problems that were not age appropriate. In fact, they were very challenging, reaching far beyond their scope of knowledge, okay? So they were asked to solve for those 10th grade problems to give them the experience of failure, because obviously they didn't do so hot, okay? That's your control variable. Both conditions experience this. Then the children were given a third set of puzzle. This time it was extremely similar to that first set of puzzle right here in trial 1. But notice what happens with their performance, okay? So again, this trial 1 and trial 3, very, very similar in terms of challenge. But in between, what ended up happening right here, trial 2 was really, really hard 10th grade level puzzles. So the students who were given process praise, their performance increased. Whereas those who were given personal praise, something to do about how smart they were, their performance decreased. And in fact, you can see how far apart they are here versus where they began. What conclusions might you draw from this? What do we think?
Okay, first question. So for the green crew, actually, no, that doesn't really matter. But so the green crew, they got like their egos boosted, and then when they got just chopped down, they were like, I guess I'm not smart. Totally lost ambition. Didn't care. And the other people were like, oh, gotta work harder. And they're like, it's about the process. It's about actually applying yourself. And then when they saw something familiar, they attacked it.
And they did better. Okay. So spot on. Anybody else? Christopher, it seemed like you had your mic off. Did you want to say something?
Oh no, I was gonna say that the people with the process praise did a lot better overall.
Yeah, they did. So you're absolutely correct. So this design, right, allows us to see that the difference in praise impacts performance. And the only way we can really show that is because we had a pretest that showed their performance was quite similar. Because now let's say you were to not do a pretest and you're like, hello, fifth graders, randomly assigned to 2 groups. You are told you're the smartest kids ever. You are told you work really hard. Let's give you 10th grade problems, and then let's give you 5th grade problems. Well, we would have this discrepancy here in scores, perhaps, but we would have no point of origin to see if, in fact, they were ever really similar. So a pretest allows us to see actually these 2 groups, they were randomly assigned, performance is pretty similar. The difference in their scores of where it ended up landing where it ended in the post-test is in fact must be due to the type of praise they received because everything else was the same. Okay. So this is the advantage of a pre-test, post-test design is it allows you far better comparison. Okay. Also, if you ever want to mess with your nieces, nephews, younger children, siblings, whatever is the way to do it. I'll mess with you. All right. So which design is better? Well, there is no one size fits all, as I'm sure you've figured out. It really just depends. In some situations, it's a real problem to do a pre-test, post-test design. For instance, can you do pre-test, post-test with eating pasta? I'm thinking people are going to tapping out and not feel so good if you're like, and round 2. Now eat with a large bowl. You'd be like, what? I can't do it, right? Or you'd have to do it over the course of months. And then who wants to eat pasta, right? You can't do it 2 days in a row. People are like, now you're probably going to have an effect, people being sick of eating pasta. So there are some situations that is not possible. Again, in some situation, makes a lot of sense to use a pre-test, post-test, like the one we just talked about, the person versus process praise. But it's important to note that if you only have a post-test design, that alone can be really powerful and can show really significant results just on its own. Okay, so within group designs, I want us to talk about concurrent measures, repeated measures, some of the advantages that we see, and then we'll talk about internal validity as well. So let's talk about concurrent measure. Concurrent measure means participants are exposed to all levels of the independent variable at roughly the same time. Okay, it occurs concurrently. So this particular example, your textbook talks about it. I didn't note the authors, I'm sorry about that. But it's the idea that infants have a looking preference based on gender. Okay. So, and you can't ask an infant now, who did you find more appealing to look like? You can't have a verbal task, right? So it's looking, you expose them to pictures and then you see where their eye gazes go. That's as much communication as an infant can really do. So you have infants come in, right, brought in, and then at the same time, concurrently, you show them a picture of a woman and a picture of a man, and then you calculate the looking preference. Where do their eye gazes go? Where do they focus? So that would be a within group design, and you are concurrently presenting the information, okay? Your book goes into greater detail about same race preference, right? The kids will look to pictures of same, that shows race bias in a way. Same, the gender, race, anyway, it's a whole mixture. All right, so that is concurrent measure design. A repeated measure design, similar idea, but you're doing it one after the other. So it's a type of within group design where participants are measured on the dependent variable more than once. So they're exposed to each level of the independent variable and then measured again. So this particular example by Bick and Dozier in 2010, the question was, do women release more oxytocin to their own toddlers versus another toddler? Oxytocin is the hormone that is known to play a large role in social bonding and the experience of love and connectedness. So the question was, do you release more of that for your own child, your kin, so to speak, or do you do that with a child that is less known to you, a new toddler? So the way they ran the study is that they had the individuals interact with their own toddlers first, and then they measured oxytocin, and then they had the moms interact with the new toddler, and then they measured oxytocin. So again, this is a repeated measure. The same people within the same group, they're exposed to all the levels of the independent variable. The levels here are your own toddler or a new toddler. Those are the two levels. So participants are exposed to both, and measurement happens twice. It's a repeated measure. Okay. And what they found.
No,
That's-
I want to know if you had the
Oh,
results.
yeah. So what they found is that they were higher when women were interacting with the new toddlers compared to their own.
Really?
So there was a greater biological effort to socially bond with the toddler than with their own toddler. Yeah.
Rude.
So, all right. So let's talk about some advantages of those within group design. Obviously, participants in your groups are equivalent because it's the same people, right? Nothing is changing. So you cannot say, oh, there's maybe something idiosyncratic about one of the condition or one of the groups, because in fact, it's all the same people. So you eliminate that possibility of, you know, heterogeneity because of it. Okay. Within groups design, also it gives researchers more power to notice differences between the different conditions. So again, power is the ability of a study to show a statistically significant result when an independent variable actually impacts a dependent variable. Okay. This reduces unsystematic variability between groups because it's the same participants, so there's less variability. And then lastly, this is kind of economies of scale, but it requires fewer participants. Within group design, you can just expose them to all the levels, right? Without having to get double the size of your participant pool. So there's definitely an advantage in that way as well. It's faster to recruit and it's faster to retain participants. Okay. Internal validity when it comes to within group designs. So order effects are a thing. So we need to be mindful of that. The order in which you present information may have an impact in the results that you have. So for instance, if you only had one of these rows here, you didn't have this random assignment, and all of your studies showed, well, they interact with their own toddler, you measure oxytocin, interact with the new toddler, measure oxytocin. It's possible that this measure may be higher because they were primed earlier by their own children, right? Like that could be a hypothesis. But if you do this random assignment and you counterbalance it, and you have some women get shown the new toddler first and you measure oxytocin, then their own toddler and oxytocin. If these two right here are still the highest measure, that truly speaks to the impact of the new toddler exposure, right? But if these two, the last ones are the highest one, well, that shows that this ends up priming or pumping up the levels of oxytocin regardless of the toddler that's showing. So if you only were doing one of these two rows, you wouldn't be able to say with certainty that your results were due to, in fact, just the presence of the new toddler. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yes.
So again, to avoid order effects, you want to try to counterbalance and have different random assignment that shows different conditions. Okay. In independent group design, right? If it's totally different groups of mothers, then you would have them randomly assigned to one group or the other, and you interact with your own toddler, measure oxytocin, versus interact with a new toddler, measure oxytocin. It's not a repeated measure, you're just comparing the groups. Inherently with this, there's some flaws, right? Because now you're dealing with totally different participants, different condition, own toddler versus new toddler. So it's going to be a little harder to feel super confident that the effect you're seeing is because of that. Okay, so let's look at this again. Again, the within groups. Sorry, my dog is barking. Come inside. Okay. The within group design, again, it minimizes variability because each participant is compared to him or herself. When we're looking at between group designs, we're comparing different individuals. So that can inherently be problematic. It may be, again, an idiosyncratic difference, right? Is there something about the participant themselves that is causing that difference? Okay. All right. So order effects, this is another potential pitfall. I swear this whole lecture is going to scare people away from ever doing experiments, but fear not, we can try to control for these things. So the idea of an order effect is being exposed to one condition affects how participants respond to other conditions. We just kind of talked about that, having an increase in oxytocin because of the secondary exposure, just because it's secondary, right? Well, what you can see in let's say without oxytocin as the example, individuals are, if you're looking at, this is a good example. You're trying to get into college, right? And you're taking the SAT prep classes. There is such a thing as getting better at the SAT because you have this practice effect. You have taken it time and time again. You've gotten comfortable with the test. So your performance increases, not necessarily because you're smarter, not necessarily because you learned anything in between, but just because you've had some practice taking that test, okay? That is what's called practice effect. So there's an improvement in your performance just because you have taken the test before. Conversely, you can get worse and worse at taking a specific test because you are becoming fatigued. So you start giving up, you're like not paying attention, not attending, and not scoring as high, obviously, because you are getting fatigued. So the order in which this happens needs to be managed so that you are minimizing as much of this error as possible, okay? The carryover effect, that's almost like a half-life issue. The idea is if you provide in an experiment for a specific new drug, if you give them the drug and then you test their performance, let's say it's a blood pressure medication, right? You give them the medication and then you test their blood pressure, and then you give them a placebo and you test their blood pressure. And if you're comparing the results on these two tests, you need to be mindful that this drug is completely out of their system before you measure their response post placebo, okay? So you need to be very aware, especially if you're running trials of drugs, as to what is the half-life of a medication so it is fully out of their system before they end up getting a placebo. Does that make sense? Hopefully kind of a no-brainer with that. All right, to avoid order effects, you can look at counterbalancing, okay? So that is thinking of every single other possibility and how you could order a test so that you have some participants take all version of this counterbalancing. So full counterbalancing is coming up with every single possibility, and all of those are given to your participants. You could also do a partial counterbalancing, and then you do a random assignment for each participant, right? So when only some of the possible conditions are used, then you are just randomly assigning participant to one or the other. So that is the way you avoid order effects. Okay. So again, now we're talking about the disadvantages of within group design. First off, there's the potential for order effects, but we can solve for that with counterbalancing. It may not be practical or possible. Again, you can't ethically, a little challenging to have participants who are being treated for cancer drugs to be exposed to a bunch of different drugs, right? That's not good for their bodies. There could be permanent change and again, ethical violations or ethical possibilities that pop up because of it. It's also hard sometimes to go back to baseline. Like if you're testing some sort of like, I don't know, weight loss, right? So then you have everybody exercise a ton and then you switch the condition, now change your nutrition. Well, you're not starting back at the same baseline. If they've done 5 weeks of heavy strength conditioning, that doesn't magically go away because you assign them to a different group. So the real world impact needs to be considered, I should say, especially if you're doing within group design. And then experiencing all the levels of an independent variable can change the way the participants act. So that is the issue of demand characteristic. So it's when participants are aware of what the researchers are trying to assess. And because of that awareness, that changes their response or their response just in general. Pre-test and post-test design within groups. Again, I don't know what just happened to my slide here. It looks all wonky. So a pre-test and post-test design, you would randomly assign them to one of the two groups. You give them each a pre-test, you expose them to the levels of your independent variable, and then you do a post-test, okay? That would be a random assignment pre-test, post-test design. A within group design would be you randomly assign them, you give them level A of your independent variable, do a measure, then you do level B and do a measure, and then you swap it here. So you control for order effects. Okay. So that would be the difference between the two. I feel like I showed you guys a slide that was very similar to that. Hopefully that's sticking. All right, let's look at the 4 causal claims for validity. So the first one, here it is, construct validity. Were the variables measured and manipulated adequately, right? How well did you test out your dependent variable? How accurately was that done? So for student performance on the INC test, they use the test called the Raven Standard Progressive Matrices, which is a well-known, it's been validated by other researchers, that shows visual puzzles. And then the child needs to see, pick the picture that completes a specific pattern. So it's basic nonverbal reasoning, logical, type of task. So with that, you need to evaluate if that's how you're measuring your dependent variable. You need to know, does it show strong reliability? Is it well respected in the literature? Is it actually a valid measure of academic performance? Like, why are you using that rather than something else? Now, what are your thoughts? Measuring academic performance with nonverbal logical reasoning. Good idea, bad idea?
Okay, sorry. I couldn't hear the last part. I was mid-sneeze.
Oh, that's okay. So is it a good idea or a bad idea to measure academic performance with nonverbal reasoning?
Ooh. I want to say it could be.
Okay.
Because if you're measuring the two, you could see that from nonverbal, like how well they're responding to the because if they're just completely like dead face and like they're just like, I don't know anything, they're not learning anything.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what do we know about the cultural impact of verbal reasoning?
I don't know.
Has
Let me
anybody,
know.
have you guys read about that or heard about that in your psych classes?
I could spitball. I mean, I did read this one thing about how like verbal communication, like some people are afraid to speak up because they feel like they're going to be criticized, so their self-esteem's too low. But
Well, in general, so the way we measure intelligence in, standardized testing, we look at verbal and nonverbal measures of intelligence. The problem is it's quite simple to do a task of verbal reasoning, right? Ask what does this word mean, like definition wise. But that is highly culturally dependent. So if you have somebody who is immigrated from another country, they will appear less intelligent because of this verbal reasoning. Okay. So nonverbal reasoning is less impacted by cultural differences and is shown to be a more reliable measure. So, like, going back to this again, if I'm looking at construct validity and I'm assessing academic ability or just general intelligence, and I'm using a nonverbal scale, that is supported by psychological research that says that is a stronger measure than just asking a verbal task. Okay. So
I'm
learn
very.
something new.
That's awesome.
All right. So again, if I'm evaluating the construct validity, I need to make sure that my dependent variable has been well measured and that my independent variable has also been manipulated adequately. So what do I mean by a manipulation check is I really want to know how well was it operationalized? Was I able to actually make sure that the levels of the independent variable were adequately represented and sorted into. So, again, we could ask them, this is the example for the process versus personal praise. You can ask children to explain their performance. Like, why do you think you dropped? You could do some post hoc test as well. All right, let's see. Anything else I want to tell you about that? You can also run a pilot study. That's kind of a trial run to see if you're getting the result that you think that you should be. So it's using a separate group of participants. Usually it's a much smaller group. And then you run through the experiment the way you would with your larger study to kind of test out or confirm the effectiveness of the independent variable manipulation. Okay. Oftentimes a pilot study, the results of it will be provided as IRB support once you run your actual experiment. And then they're often even written, if you read a peer-reviewed journal article, sometimes they'll even report the results of their pilot study. It's like a trial run. Okay, so again, construct validity and theory testing. So the construct validity of both the independent variable and the dependent variable needs to be evaluated, but you will see that the variables that are operationalized are driven by the theory of the experiment. So in the ink color study, they were testing the theory about avoidance orientation in academic tasks. Based on that theory, they thought that people would demonstrate an avoidance to the red ink. So although the data supports this, others might argue that participants exhibited avoidance to red because it's a warm color. This was another idea they had. So you could have added a fourth color, like a warm color condition, to see if other warm colors also led to poor performance. That would have been another way to do it. You can see here, hold on just one second.
Also, so just for this study,
Mhm.
was this like multiple, is this set up like multiple choice questions? Do you know that?
I don't know that for sure. Hold on. This is chapter 10. I think not the anagrams, obviously, because they just had to solve for those. And I think the vocab question in math may have been, it may have been multiple choice.
The only reason why I brought it up was because there's 3 colors and multiple choices typically out of 4.
Mm-hmm. That's true. I'm looking.
Thank you, by the way.
Let's see here. You know, I don't have it written. It's not, I'm not showing that particular slide. Stay tuned, because my version of your textbook talks about taking notes as opposed to eating pasta, which is another way that you can, another simple experiment. Yeah, I'll get back to you on that. I'll pull up the study.
Thank you.
No problem. All right, so, okay, what was I describing?
If there was a warm color.
Yeah, no, and so you could do a warm color. That would be one way you could do that. But the other way that you could also do it, or you could evaluate the construct validity, is you'd want to make sure that the number, the challenge or the difficulty level in each booklet was similar, right? So that if students performed far worse with the red ink booklet, that it wasn't because they had harder questions, right? Or vice versa, that they had super easy questions compared to the other ones. It needs to be fairly equalized and evenly spread out. Okay, so again, this is going back to the construct validity. How well were the variables actually both measured and how well were they manipulated. You want to make sure that it's as accurate as possible. Okay, external validity. We've certainly talked about this a lot this semester as well. That is, how well do the results of our study generalize to the larger population as a whole? Because again, we are not testing, and we're certainly not running experiments on an entire population. You get a sample and you want that sample to be representative of the population at large. So does it generalize both to the larger population, and does it generalize to other situations? You don't want something that is so incredibly specific that it can never be replicated in any other settings, right? That's not going to be helpful. Yeah. Now, what do you do if the external validity of your study is actually poor? Well, that's not necessarily a deal breaker, especially if there is strong internal validity. So if you have an incredibly specific sample that you utilize, that may be okay, because future studies can look into replicating the study with a larger group. But you need to then have a really, really strong internal validity. So again, the reason why this happens, like poor external validity, is there are some experiments that are run in a lab. So you're under the conditions of a laboratory environment. How well will that generalize? Probably not all that well, but it's at least a step in the right direction to measure in a very controlled environment whether certain social phenomena are present. Okay. Statistical validity, that's another one of the validity claims, right? So is there a difference that is statistically significant, meaning the results that we got were not due to chance, or the probability that they were due to chance were incredibly low? So that is what we're asking when we ask about or significant results, statistically significant result. Similarly, you can look at effect size. Now, effect size can help impact covariance. Usually the larger the effect size, the stronger the causal effect. But in some experiments, even having a small effect size may be helpful. And I think we've talked about this in this class. We talked about aspirin. Did we talk about that? So there's a small effect size, like will aspirin actually reduce your risk of heart disease? Did we talk about that? Or
Briefly.
Okay. So yeah, the bulk of that is, yeah, just taking aspirin is not going to reduce your risk of heart disease. But if you're having symptoms of a heart attack, taking an aspirin will greatly reduce the risk that you will die from that heart attack. So on its own, it is a small effect size, right? Like aspirin to treat heart disease, not great. But it can have a powerful impact in the moment. And it's such a small, it's a small thing. It's not costly. Doesn't take hours to do. It's not like a specific treatment. So there's still some value in using it. So sometimes even though you have a small effect size, it can still be impactful, I guess is the bottom line. Okay. Now, the 3 questions you want to always ask yourself with any experiment is, were there any design confounds? And again, when you guys talk about it in your discussion section for your paper, you will need to ask yourself that question. Were there any other variables that could explain away what I got as my result outside of what I'm measuring? Okay. That is often going to be found in a subheading called limitations of your study, right? What are some of the limitations? Common ones will be smaller sample size, but then design confounds is another one that needs to be discussed. If you decided to use an independent group design, which again, for our study, we're not doing that, did you control for selection effects by using random assignments or matching groups? And then if you had a within group design where maybe you had a repeated measure, did you control for order effects by counterbalancing? So those are the 3 questions that you really want to check into for internal validity, to make sure that, you have a sound study. Okay, questions about that?
No, I
Is that all tracking?
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay. All right. So just want to make sure we're all on the same page with all of that. Now we are, let's see, where are you? Okay. Let me pull up Course Connect. It's 3:00 already. How is it 3:00? We need to
Time
get started.
flies.
Was that?
I said time flies when you're having fun.
There you go. Hopefully that's how everyone feels here. Let's take another 15-minute break and then we'll start on chapter 11. I just don't want us to get behind, you guys. I know it's a super lecture heavy day, but we gotta stick with it. So we'll at least get chapter 11 started. So let's gather back up at 3:15.
Awesome. Bye.
Okay. All right. Thanks, guys.